Okay. James, can you tag me? Oh, there we go. Okay, hi everybody. Hi Lori, I see you. Welcome to the Pen of Justice, William Apess and his eulogy on King Philip. And I should say at the outset that this session is being recorded. So if you were doing anything personal, please stop your video right away. So I'm speaking to you on behalf of the all volunteer Public History Society focusing on the 17th century. We have members in the UK and the US, and traditionally we've been focusing primarily on the Puritans. This year, we're devoting our public history programming to looking at the history of Native Americans in the 17th century in New England. And that includes both events about the kind of rich, vibrant culture of Native New England in the 17th century, but also the programs about the history that the Puritans did not want you to know about. That is the war, the violence, the dispossession of land, the enslavement, the capturing of people, and the violence that we know about, violence that was cultural as well as physical in battle. So that's our job for the year. I'm not going to make a terribly formal land acknowledgement, but I do want to take a minute to say that we all have to recognize that in Massachusetts, at least, and in most states in the United States, almost all the land in this state was once native land. And we need to, part of our purpose is to look back at the injustices that led to that disposition and to think about how that came about, what were the factors, and what are the consequences today. That take stock and enable all of us to take stock and think about what that means. So this evening we are looking at a 19th century Pequot minister, activist, and writer who will help us take stock, I think, by looking back at the 17th century and particular look at the kind of defining conflict of the 17th century, King Philip's War, which is the bloodiest American war on a per capita basis that we've ever been involved in. And you'll see when you hear Professor Lopenzina's presentation and we talk about it, Apess entirely upended the way the 17th century battle was meant to be understood and the role of Native people was meant to be understood, and that sort of historic truths that people had absorbed from childhood, and he turned them all on their head. And at the same time, he managed to insist that Native people were still present, they were still alive, they had a role, they had a voice. And he was obviously a living example of that as a writer, an eloquent writer at that, powerful and eloquent. So just a couple of things, and then I'll introduce Professor Lopenzina. I want to thank the Bridge Street Fund of Mass Humanities for supporting this program. We're really appreciative. The format for this evening is, as usual, we have a presentation. This evening will be about 40 minutes, and then we open up for questions and discussions. We are hoping that you all dutifully read Eulogy on King Philip, and if you haven't, really you should. It's so powerful and bold and rhetorically interesting that it's more than worth your time. So we're hoping you're coming with your observations and comments. To ask a question, either write it in the chat at the bottom of your screen as we go along, or when we'll open it up and unmute everybody during the sort of discussion period. But then you want to raise the little hand. You click on the button at the bottom called reactions, and that would enable you to raise the hand. So we know that you want to speak. So let me introduce Professor Lopenzina, he is Professor of Early American and Native American Literature at Old Dominion University in Virginia. He is the author of multiple scholarly articles in academic scholarly journals. But most notably for us, he's written two wonderful, really important books, from which we selected a reading for you. The first one is Red Ink, Native Americans Picking Up the Pen in the Colonial Period, which is really an eye-opener. It talks about people you've never heard of, but who we really want to hear from now. And then obviously, then most recently, his biography of William Apess, which is through an Indian's looking glass, a cultural biography of William Apess, Pequot. And I urge you to buy this book because it's really wonderful and completely absorbing and takes you into the background and it tells you everything you need. So over to you, Drew. And so we're looking forward to it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, James Boggy and Roxanne Reddington Wild for organizing this talk, and the Partnership of Historic Boston for inviting me here. And thanks all of you for joining me tonight. I really appreciate your attention and presence to this topic. It has been my mission for the last, really, perhaps my whole academic life over the last 10 or 15 years to get word out about William Apess. I feel like people should know who William Apess is and how important and really exciting he is. And I feel he should have a kind of name recognition that is the equivalent of Frederick Douglass. And when I give these talks, everybody knows who Frederick Douglass is. Very few people know who William Apess is, but from an indigenous standpoint, William Apess is a voice that is as resistant and powerful and compelling as Douglass is in so many ways. And interesting to think that he's writing really a couple of decades prior to Douglass. And so one of the things that has become clear to me as part of our current discourse that we're having nationally is that William Apess is, in fact, one of the very first practitioners of critical race theory. I don't mean that in jest, and when you read his eulogy on King Philip, you start to see how what William Apess is doing is understanding the colonial dynamic as one that is systemically racist, and that not only the dynamics, the politics, but history itself has embedded racism in it. And this is what Apess does so compellingly in his eulogy, is he re-examines the history and has this awareness that we can't have equity in our lives and in this nation unless we start to tell history in a different way. So I am going to find my way into my PowerPoint presentation here and begin. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I don't know if I have a little bar at the top of my screen that's blocking some of the image. I don't know if that's happening for you guys. Can you see that? Just looking at the whole thing, it's clear, it's unimpeded. Okay,
It's
good.
clear. It's simply you as the presenter who has that lovely little bar scaring you. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I actually have to think about how to move that as well. Okay, so the presentation is the pen of Justice William Apess and his eulogy on King Philip. And I should say that it's important to have these types of conversations. I'm thrilled to be here. It's also important to remember that that this is indigenous space from which from which this talk is based, and these are the traditional lands of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag people. They are the traditional caretakers of this space, and one of the first uncomfortable truths that perhaps we have to grapple with when we're dealing with writers like Apess is that we are here really but only by right of conquest, and this is something that is uncomfortable to hear sometimes. It's uncomfortable to grapple with. On some extent, I think we all accept and understand that it's true, and yet historically it's amazing the sort of contortions and rhetorical gymnastics that we go through to ameliorate that reality and to conceal it from ourselves. So what we're looking at here is an image of Metamora, who by Frederick Styles Agate in 1832. And Metamora was a literary stand-in for King Philip, And this is a beautiful painting in many ways. And it's an image that I think is quite familiar to us when we think about Native people, particularly going back to the 19th or 18th century. We think of this type of figure, the lone warrior, brave, savage, noble, all of those things. And there's nothing necessarily terribly wrong with that, except for the fact that it's the only image that we really allow ourselves culturally when we think about Native people. And when that image gets reproduced over and over and over again, it creates a kind of violence. It causes a kind of violence to Native identity. It refuses or forecloses on the ability that Native people can also be, fathers and parents and diplomats and have other roles and are members of loving communities and aren't simply always these noble savages in stances of isolation. This picture, Metamora, comes from John Augustus Stone's early 19th century play, the Metamora, the Last of the Wampanoags. And it was a play that was incredibly popular in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century. It was the most popular play of its time. It had a run of a couple of decades, and night after night we would see Metamora, who was in fact King Philip, die on the stage and signal the end of the Wampanoag as a people. This is the image that we hold in our mind, and perhaps it makes it difficult to some extent to think about William Apess, who is not the Native person that we generally have in mind. William Apess doesn't look to us how a Native person should look, and certainly when he writes, we often don't even understand or think about Native people as writers and authors in the early 19th century, and wearing settler clothes and practicing Christianity. And Apess did all of these things. In this, he was not an exception. He was the norm. And so when I'm researching William Apess and thinking about William Apess, one of the things that I like to point out is that his life, for me, in my research, provided a really useful lens to think about what life was like for Native people in the Northeast in that first half of the 19th century, that he's not the exception. He is actually, in many ways, doing what other Native people are doing at the time. And I tried to think about this when I wrote my biography of William Apess, Through an Indian's Looking Glass. So William Apess was a member of the Pequot tribe. He was born in 1798 in Coleraine, Massachusetts. However, his family came from southern Connecticut, which is where the Pequot tribe is based, and they quickly moved back down to the Coleraine area, to the Colchester, Connecticut area, shortly after William Apess's birth. He was an indentured servant as a child, and this is not something that I think is common for us to think about Native people, but it was, again, the norm. Most Native children at this time, their families had been compressed into very small parcels of land. They couldn't hunt or grow in the manner that they had once used to sustain themselves, and they were really shut out of the otherwise settler colonial economy. And so they lived in really bone-crunching poverty, and they were so impoverished that they were forced to send their kids to basically work as free labor for the neighboring white families in the area. And so William Apess did this from age 5 to about 15. And in this, he was like very many other Native children at this time. However, he ran away from his indenture at 15 years of age. And this was interesting because this was illegal. It was basically you were a bondservant. That was a contract, and to break that contract meant you were breaking the law. And he could have been fined for it and punished. And more importantly, perhaps, his father could have been punished and fined for it. And the fines could be so heinous at times that it could land you in debtor's prison. And this was another way that Native people were sort of kept in a subjugated state. He went to New York City, and there were groups of people at the time, this is 1813, who were roaming about trying to recruit people for the War of 1812. And in fact, these recruitment agents, their practice was to go around and find people, get them drunk, and get them to sign up. William Apess was not old enough to serve in the Army. He was only 15 years old at the time, but they lied about his age on his enlistment papers. And so all of a sudden, William Apess was in the Army. And I just want to point out that this, too, was the norm. Most Native men at the time found themselves fighting alongside either the English colonists or when we became our own country with the United States Army, in every war that has been fought since the time that Europeans first settled here. We usually think of Native people as the adversaries, I suppose, that they are, it's cowboys and Indians, and we're always stuck in that paradigm. But Native people have always fought in U.S. wars. They fought in every war that we've ever been engaged in, and this was no exception with William Apess, who served with an artillery unit in the War of 1812. He was marched up to Plattsburgh, and he fought in a number of engagements on the battle, where most of the actual fighting of the War of 1812, it's not a war we think about a lot, and we have very little, I think, cultural conception of what happened there, but most of the fighting actually did happen along the U.S.-Canadian border. He was involved in many of those battles and some of the decisive battles, and so by the age of 15, 16 years old, he's already he's been a bondservant. He's been mistreated as a bondservant. He felt he was treated as a slave, and he was certainly whipped and punished in many ways. He has been recruited as a miner. He has seen combat and battle in all of its horror. And after all of that, he drifts around for a couple of years. And really, it's kind of a miracle that at this point, William Apess, with the traumas and the prejudice and the bias that he's faced, that he can actually stand on his own 2 feet at all. But in fact, he begins to collect himself over time, and he decides that he is going to join up with the Methodists. And he is basically self-taught. He had some schooling during his indenture, but not a lot. But he begins to really educate himself to read and write and to speak out in a public way. And so by 1832, after going through a long process that met with a great deal of resistance, nevertheless, he becomes an ordained Methodist minister of the Protestant Methodist Church. And he will use that pulpit as a place to use Christianity and the authority that is conferred upon him from that pulpit to critique U.S. colonial attitudes towards Native people, towards people of color, and he's very inclusive in the kind of rhetoric that he uses at this time. He writes 5 books, and in this he is an exception. Native people are writing at this time. It's surprising how many Native people are actually literate and actively using alphabetic literacy or European writing to try to further their own causes. But Apess is really the first Native American figure to write book-length narratives about his life, about events that happened to him, about his activism and advocacy for Native people. And this is an incredible accomplishment at this time. Really amazing that he's able to overcome all the obstacles in his way in order to do this. And he uses this once again as an activist for Native rights. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So his first book was A Son of the Forest. It was published in 1829. And there was a second edition published in 1831 where we have the only image that exists of William Apess, comes from that second edition of A Son of the Forest. His other books, he published a sermon in 1831, The Increase of the Kingdom of Christ, probably the most conventional piece of writing that Apess ever delivered. I believe he intended it for his ordination sermon. The Experiences of 5 Christian Indians in 1833, and Indian Nullification in 1835. And then finally in 1836, William Apess publishes the Eulogy on King Philip, which we'll be talking about to some extent today. And so King Philip, this is an image of King Philip. I remember when my first book came out, Red Ink, Native Americans picking up the pen in the Colonial Period, the editors wanted to put this picture on it, and I was like, please do not put this on the cover of my book. It sort of represents everything that I don't believe somebody like Philip represented, that he was the scowling, skulking, angry, brooding figure that history has often made of him. But Nevertheless, Eulogy on King Philip, William Apess tells us, and so here's just a little foretaste of his writing from that. He says, "O Christians, can you answer for those beings that have been destroyed by your hostilities, and beings too that lie endeared to God as yourselves? Will you presume to say that you are executing the judgments of God by doing so? As it is certain that every time they celebrate the day of the pilgrims," this is the day that he marks as the Pilgrims' landing at Plymouth Rock, which we still celebrate. Every time they celebrate the day of the pilgrims, they do. "Although in words they deny it, yet in the works they approve of the inequities of their fathers. And as the seed of inequity and prejudice was sown in that day, so it still remains. And there is a deep-rooted and popular opinion in the hearts of many that the Indians were made on purpose for destruction, to be driven out by white Christians, and they to take their places, and that God had decreed it from all eternity." So that's the kind of stuff that William Apess was writing in 1836, and you can imagine that that was not a difficult message to deliver. I mean, that it was a difficult message to deliver then. It's still, in many ways, a difficult message to deliver now. So I want to back up a little bit, and to understand, why is William Apess the pen of justice? We first have to understand a little bit of the injustice that William Apess was combating. And so we begin by looking at this. You may be familiar with this particular image. This is the official seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company, which came over in 1830. And this is the way that they wanted to present themselves to the world. It was kind of their Nike swoosh or their logo or whatever. And it shows a naked native in a sort of Edenic pose, I guess. I don't even know how to explain what he's wearing there between his legs, but nevertheless, and peaceful. He's separated his bow and arrow, and he's saying, "Come over and help us." And so the Europeans who first came here, the English settlers who first came here in 1830, had this idea that they were coming in this benign way to bring the improvements of civilization to these savage, ignorant people. So, and the idea that Native people were savage and ignorant was something that was reinforced over and over in writings, but more particularly, we can see it in images like this painting from 1838, Thomas Cole's The Savage State, which shows this pre-colonial landscape where Native people are running like deer through the woods, perhaps chasing deer. It's a dark and gloomy place. You can see a little tiny village here, perhaps a few teepees. Native people in the Northeast didn't live in teepees, but that didn't matter. And of course, this idea that this was the world before Europeans showed up was reinforced by just about every European writer on the scene at the time. William Bradford, writing in the 1620s, 30s, or 40s, wrote, "Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness filled with wild beasts and wild men?" And there were many people who were happy to disseminate that notion over and over again. And if you believe that it was a wild, uninhabited space, or a space that was only inhabited by wild beasts and wild men, then you could also have the notion that this land, that you could simply claim it for yourselves, and that the borders, in fact, you could claim possession of lands going all the way out ad infinitum, which is what the settlers did. In the 1753 map, they were claiming lands that, in fact, they'd never even seen before. They didn't know how far this continent stretched out, but they were happy to say, there's nothing there, and so it's ours for the taking. Again, from William Bradford and Edward Winslow, who wrote Mort's Relation, one of the really the first published document to come out of the settlement. They wrote, "They are not industrious, neither have art, science, skill, or faculty to use either the land or the commodities of it. So it is lawful now to take a land which none useth, and make use of it." And this is it's a remarkable claim that the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Pilgrims, are making at this point, because nothing could be further from the truth. And we'll get to that in a second. But it's also important to realize that we still reinforce this idea, and you can find any number of history books that will show how the North American continent is divided up by European powers that once again reenact the complete erasure of native presence, as though native people simply didn't exist, or if they did, it was inconsequential in comparison to the fact that the English were here and the French were here and Spanish were here, and on and on. So let's think about what Native people did. What were their lives actually like? Native people were village peoples. They often lived in New England or around the area that will become New England. They lived in fortified villages that could hold up to anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people, perhaps, in a standard village. This is an image of what is an artist rendition of a Pequot village at the time. And they lived in houses. These are called long houses. Roger Williams, who was in Rhode Island at the time, will talk in his writings of sometimes entering one of these abodes and there being well over 100 people in a single structure. And so we shouldn't imagine that these are small structures or that Native people were incapable of having a cultivated village life. They practiced what is now today referred to as Three Sisters agriculture, where they grew beans, squash, and corn in a sort of symbiotic relationship where the beans would wrap around the corn stalk and the squash would help from its blossoms, I guess, would keep away insects and pests. And this type of agriculture, I'm really describing it in a very simple way because I don't necessarily understand it myself, but nevertheless, it was incredibly productive, and Native people with apparently a great deal less labor than Europeans put into their farming were able to be incredibly agriculturally productive, and Europeans were amazed at the amount of corn and beans and other products that they craved that the Native people were growing. And in fact, the idea, so just to hammer this home a little bit more, this is an image that Samuel de Champlain, a map that he drew in 1607 when he came to New England. And what he saw were basically villages, and the way that he created a simple icon of a village is you have a hut and then you have cornfields, and this is what New England was. We're told it's a vast wilderness, a desert wilderness, as William Bradford often referred to it, a sort of primeval wilderness, but it was nothing of the sort. It was a village world. It was cleared. It was cultivated. So trying to break through that fog, even if we intellectually understand this, I sometimes, because every semester I teach all of these texts, and when we're reading Bradford or perhaps Mary Rowlandson, you might be familiar with in her captivity narrative, it's so easy to get back into that desert wilderness state, that dense wilderness when we're reading these things, because it's so persuasively conveyed as such by these writers, and yet it was nothing of the sort, and coming to that understanding is really important. John White, who was part of the early Roanoke expedition in the 1580s, was here. He came to the Virginia shoreline and painted images that show nothing but cornfields going as far as the eye can see and fortified villages. And again, Native people that he was a firsthand witness to, but don't look like what we think Native people are supposed to look like. And of course, we hold on to this idea that it's this wonderful idea that even when we do the Thanksgiving thing and these two cultures coming together, it's sort of always the Europeans who are seen doing the giving. And you can see, I could show you 10 different paintings of this event that have that similar flow. The Native people are low on the ground. The Puritan people are up high and upright, and they are taking the food and giving it to the Native people. I'm just going to make this claim, is that there wasn't a single English colony that would have survived in this continent if not for the surplus food of Native Americans. They depended on the surplus food of Native Americans, and if it hadn't been for those great surpluses that Native people willingly traded with them, none of these colonies or colonists could have survived. They all would have starved to death if not for this bounty of native agriculture that we so sort of blithely dismiss and erase the existence of. And this is compelling. Deborah Spears Moorhead, who is a Wampanoag Narragansett artist, recently painted this painting, which shows, it's called 50 Mashoons on the Connecticut River, and it shows that the Hartford colony, at a time when they were starving in 1638, that the Pecumtuck came down the Connecticut River in 50 canoes filled with bushels of corn to save the colony from starving. And again, this is a history that has simply been erased. It's never told, and it's so exciting when Native artists are able to bring it back to the fore and make us aware of these moments. So the Pequot lived along what is today the Long Island Sound. They were positioned in the valley between the Connecticut River Valley and what is today the Thames River. And they were often thought of as the most powerful native group at the time when the settlers first came here. Nevertheless, the settlers had great relations with the Pequot when they first arrived. They traded with them. They had nothing but kind words to say about them for the first 10 or 12 years of colonization. The Pequot, because of where they were positioned, were at the head of the wampum trade. And what we're looking at here are wampum shells. These are quahog shells out of which wampum was made. And most of you have probably heard the idea that wampum is Indian money. It's the way that it was often related to us historically. But Native people did not have a capitalist society. They were not looking to make profits. They didn't have capital or money the way that we think about it. But they had wampum, and they made wampum into belts and beads. And wampum had great ceremonial, spiritual, and diplomatic value to Native people, not just on the shorelines, but going inland as well. And what the colonists soon found out is that these seemingly worthless shells could be traded for extremely valuable furs, especially with the inland tribes. This is just another example of a wampum belt, a famous example. It's the Hiawatha belt of the Haudenosaunee, who were the Iroquois. They were one of those inland tribes. The two-row wampum belt that the Mohawk created to celebrate their first diplomatic agreement with the Dutch in the area of what is today Albany, saying that we will both share this land together, two different cultures, one in a canoe, one in a boat, but sharing the same space. And the Dutch, understanding this relationship between wampum and the wampum trade, and that they could trade shells for fur, they sort of caught on to this before the English did. And their seal, in fact, shows, this is, if you can tell, this is a beaver in the center here, surrounded by wampum beads. And so the official seal of the Dutch acknowledges this important economic relationship for their colony. When the Massachusetts settlers found out about this, they were... well, it was an eye-opener, and all of a sudden, the friendly Pequot became public enemy number one. And in 1637, the General Court at Hartford declared, "It is ordered that here shall be an offensive war against the Pequots." And I just want to reiterate, offensive. The Pequot had not really done anything yet or projected any hostilities against the colonists, but now all of a sudden it was assumed that they would, and so the Pequot's army was levied to go and attack the Pequot people. It was an offensive war, it was an aggressive war on the part of the colonists because they wanted to control the wampum trade themselves. And this resulted in what is known as the Pequot War, 1636 and 1637. And this is the only existing image of the Pequot War. It shows the Pequot village, excuse me. And the village, which the settlers attacked at dawn in 1637, is surrounded by colonists in this image. And then the second ring around it are the Narragansett, who had aided the colonists in finding the fort. The colonists tried to attack the fort. They were repulsed. And then in the morning breeze, they lit the fort on fire, and it began to catch. And within less than an hour, everybody within that village, I call it a fort, but really it's a fortified village, they were all burnt to death. Anybody who tried to get out was shot. Accounts from the time reckon there was anywhere between 500 to 800 deaths, Pequot people burned to death in this conflagration. Excuse me. The Narragansett, who had allied with the English afterwards, came up to one of the leaders of this battle and said, "Your war is too furious. It kills too many men. We want no part of it." This was nothing like what Native people understood war to be, that it could be this brutal and kill innocent people in these ways. You'll have to excuse me. I'm just getting over a cold that my doctors assure me was not COVID. But at any rate, the leaders of the war, one of the commanders of this battle, John Mason, wrote afterwards, "Thus was God seen in the mount, crushing his proud enemies and the enemies of his people, they who were erewhile a terror to all that were round about them." And I want to emphasize that at this point, or at the point when the English launched the war, the Pequot were accused of killing maybe 2 people. There were, and really they were indirectly related to that. But nevertheless, they were a terror to all that were around about them, who resolved to destroy all the English and root their very name out of the country, bring the mischief they plotted and the violence they offered and exercised upon their own heads in a moment, burning them up in the fire of his wrath. This wasn't the Puritans doing, it was God's doing. And dunging the ground with their flesh. It was the Lord's doing. A law was passed that the Pequot name shall never be spoken again. And so I give you this history to sort of understand what it meant for somebody like William Apess to be born a Pequot in 1798, and the history that is already forming his existence. After the Pequot War, the Puritans seemed to remember that they were supposed to be converting the natives and not killing them, and they put out a document called First Fruits of New England. And this document was supposed to celebrate the many converts that the English had found. Unfortunately, there were very few, if any, and they had to make a few of them up. And for the other ones, they mentioned the Pequot children. What they didn't mention were these were the children who were the survivors of the conflagration that had killed their parents and their families and their community and their loved ones. And now they were being trotted out as the sort of celebrity converts to Christianity, the first fruits, as it were. They were really prisoners of war who were undoubtedly horribly traumatized by what they had been through. But nevertheless, there it was. And then John Eliot, who's known as the Apostle to the Indians, began his outreach to native communities. He's always shown up on a rock somewhere preaching to the natives in the woods again, as though that's what natives did, just sat around in the woods. And if you go to these actual documents, you'll see that John Eliot went to their communities. He went into their longhouses, which were their spiritual center, and that's where his sermon began. And it really was a very different kind of encounter, maybe a little bit more symbiotic than the record suggests. Native people were then, a few representatives were brought to Harvard College. Most people don't know that the Harvard Indian College was one of the first buildings in the Harvard campus. It was the first brick building. It housed not only a number of native people, at any moment, we're not exactly sure, but we know at least 4 or 5, maybe a few more were there. It also housed the first printing press of the colony, and the printing press was run by one of these converted natives who was living at the Indian College, James Printer. And so it's interesting to think that all the printed material coming out of the colonies in the 17th century is coming out of this native space, the Indian College, and it's native people who have their hands on the press at this time. And the first Bible to be printed in America is printed in the Algonquian language. And the translators who translated this Bible into the Algonquian were the native conscripts or scholars that were working with John Eliot to convert the Old and New Testament. And so it's fascinating to think just how involved native people were in printing and literature in the colonies at this time. So by 1661, and we're working our way up to King Philip's War here, there was a new seal that was clearly a riff on the old seal. The New England Company put out this new image of the native who was still saying, "Come over and help us," still articulating that same mission, although clearly no native ever said that. But now he had changed. He had become more sophisticated looking, still kind of naked, but he's got a nice scholarly cape on, and he's holding a book, which is the Indian Bible. And he's even gotten a little whiter in the process, and he's dropped his bow and arrow, and he's foot is stepping forward. It's this forward progress. It's still this idea that the mission has always been a benign one, an altruistic mission to bring civilization to the native people, to those who had ever sat in hellish darkness, as some of the pilgrims noted. And this was the advertisement. This was the propaganda. Right up through the 1660s, it seemed possible that King Philip, and this is a picture of King Philip wearing his wampum belt, and his regalia, but King Philip would have been a great prize to convert him, and it was believed that he might convert to Christianity. But it went the other way. It turns out that Christianity, that native people were not going to accept Christianity through persuasion. It was only going to happen through coercion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. As we think about, instead of native people agreeing to become Christians and living whatever life the Europeans had imagined for them, it broke out into a war that's known as King Philip's War in 1675, and right on to about 1678 or 9 if you take Lisa Brooks' newer account of the war. So King Philip's War, historians over the years have given us a lot of reasons for King Philip's War. We're told that, first of all, it was encroachment. Europeans, more and more of them were coming. The Great Migration had taken place. They had exponentially increased their population, and that required more land, and they were pushing and pushing into native lands. When Massasoit died, or Osamoquin, as his actual Wampanoag name, he had been one of the first people to treat with the Pilgrims, and peace had lasted amongst the Wampanoag, at least, and the Pilgrims throughout these 40 years. But now, with his passing, it was Massasoit's sons who take over. The first was Alexander, and the Europeans, the Pilgrims, the English, decided that they were going to finally now act, and they made a move to disarm the Wampanoag. They said they had to give up all their arms. They brought in Alexander and basically detained him. And while he was actually returning from that event, he dies. Nobody knows why. It's a historical mystery. Native people thought he was poisoned. And that's when the younger son, Philip, or Metacom, takes over. And so those are all, there's more reasons, and I can't go into all of them at the moment, but it's always sort of put on the natives as though, the natives, all these things had happened and it was too much, and they finally, they finally had to retaliate. And there's truth to that, but I feel that it could be, there's another way of looking at this, is that it's not really what the natives or how they were responding or making a choice. I firmly believe that it was the English who courted war. They wanted this war. They were willing to attain this power through peaceful means if they could. I'll just read to you for a moment from my book, Red Ink, where I'm covering this. And so the natives of New England and the colonists, despite their concerns, conflicts, disagreements, and grievances, had existed side by side as neighbors for many years, mostly in a state of peace, involved in economic and cultural transactions that were more complex, more complex, ritualized, and tightly integrated than has been generally credited. Nevertheless, the condition of New England in the 1670s were not those of a civil war, as a number of Neil Salisbury, who is a great scholar, and not to contradict him, but that's his claim, and others, James Drake, called it a civil war between neighbors, really. But it was not a civil war. The conditions in the 1970s were created by an environment of constant pressure, coercion, and forced capitulations. The English did everything within their power to work their will amongst the indigenous peoples in their midst, and though they would continue to assert their will peaceably if able, they were not opposed to forcing the issue or shedding even innocent blood to achieve their ends. No doubt they hadn't predicted just how costly in blood and treasure such a conflict would be. As Sarah pointed out earlier, this was per capita of people involved, the bloodiest war in U.S. history. But regardless of this ill-fated miscalculation, the desired outcome was achieved. An entire people whose claims to the land were problematic in terms of English desires for growth and hegemony were brought into containment through concerted efforts that ultimately reached their fruition through the violence of war. The indigenous groups, on the other hand, did all they could to uphold their title to the land and their right for coexistence in this space, submitting to countless threats, losses, and indignities. Many of those indignities bore the mark of Philip's insignia, the P that presided over each capitulation. When the breaking point finally came, many natives of New England would begin to express themselves by other means, not only through acts of retaliation and violence, but by using writing to voice their dissent rather than their spiritual complacency or compliance. I'm sorry. And this is
Sorry, Drew, can I just say it's just about 7:45 to 8.
okay.
So another 10, 15 minutes, is that going to be enough for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Let's hope. So, so William Apess, this is the history that William Apess has survived, basically. And he says in an earlier work, talking about the condition of native peoples after King Philip's War, he says, let a gentleman or lady of integrity visit these places, and they would be surprised as they wandered from one hut to the other. They would view with the females who are left alone, children half starved, and some almost naked as they came into the world, while the females are left without protection and are seduced by white men and are finally left to become common prostitutes for them and to be destroyed by that burning, fiery curse, rum. And when William Apess is painting this picture, it's important to understand that he's not speaking from a remove. This was his childhood and the existence that he lived through and what he witnessed and what he endured, and what he was seeing going on all around him. So in my own research about William Apess, studying his life, I follow his, I could follow a lot of what happened with him because historians don't really haven't followed his life or uncovered many things, but the newspapers, he shows up a surprisingly amount of times. So this was when he ran away from his indenture at the age of 15, and a notice by William Williams, his bondmaster, to have him returned. And here's a notice of William Apess. Of the Pequot Indians will preach tomorrow evening at 7:30 in the Frankfurt Church. William Apess preached all around the eastern seaboard. He went as far as Bangor, Maine. I've seen him as far south as Washington, D.C. And you can basically follow his steps by these newspaper notices, showing him in Georgetown in Washington at this point, where he's giving a sermon, and to Mashpee, where it is said that William Apess was involved in the unloading of a number of carts that his white neighbors had come into and taken their wood, and he had those carts unloaded and said they offered no violence whatsoever to the whites employed in taking the wood. So these sort of newspaper stories track his life. William Apess had gone to Mashpee in 1833 to visit the indigenous people there. He preached at their meeting house, which is still standing, and he realized that this meeting house built for the very purpose of Christianizing native people in the 18th century, late 18th century, was now taken over by white people. There were no native people in the house, and he thought this was odd, but realized that this space had been appropriated for the benefit of the white neighbors to the natives there. And so he became involved in trying to help the Mashpee gain their own autonomy as a tribe. He joined with Mashpee leaders like Blind Joe Amos and Solomon Adequin, who had been for many years trying to rally the Mashpee and get them to petition the system, the state government, to let them rule themselves. Natives at this time were really controlled by groups of overseers who were appointed by the state and had the power over native people of feudal lords. They could basically steal their pay, steal their resources, take whatever they wanted. They could take their children and bind them out to white families. All it took was for an overseer to say, this person is a bad parent. And there would be no follow-up. They could just do whatever they wanted. And native people all over New England lived under this system. So William Apess came and he said that we're going to get together and we're going to make some proposals. And then he took these proposals and he brought them to all of the connections that he had made in the press at the time. And so the Liberator here, which was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, published William Apess's demands, where he said, William Apess, the Mashpee are resolved that we as a tribe will rule ourselves and have a right to do so, for all men are born free and equal, and that we will not permit any white man to come upon our plantation to cut and carry off wood or hay or any other article without our permission after the 1st of July next. Well, the white people did come in and cut wood, and the newspapers, and William Apess came and they made them unload it, and they moved the carts out, and it was all done peacefully. But the press at the time had a different way of viewing it, and as you can see from these headlines, they sensationalized matters: hostilities in Mashpee, Indian war in Massachusetts, and on and on. These Indians who harbor in Dukes County recently taken up arms against the state. William Apess was very conscious of making this a peaceful act of civil resistance, and in fact may be the first person to successfully launch an act of civil resistance in the United States. For his troubles, he was thrown in jail for a month, and the papers reported on that as well. William Apess, the preacher of the Pequot tribe of Indians, and 6 of the Mashpee tribe were indicted at the last term of court, sitting at Barnstable, for a riot among the Mashpee Indians. This was utterly peaceful. He was also charged with breaking and entering because he went into their own meeting house and used that as a place to give a speech. So let's circle back again. Native people, just like the Mashpee in this instance, who were simply looking for the right of self-government, were treated as though they were hostile, they were dangerous, they were a threat. And this is what we're being told in the literature of the time, books like James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, and the artwork of the time, where you can see over and over again the kind of images in which Native people are treated as a threat, as savage threats. And this goes on really right up into our own times in many cases. And it was under these circumstances that Apess wrote his eulogy on King Philip. It was first delivered in 1836, or at least the published version was based on the 1836 rendition that he gave at the Odeon Theater in Boston. And this is an image of the Odeon at the time. And William Apess began by saying, "I do not arise to spread before you the fame of a noted warrior, neither do I approve of war as being the best method of bowing to the haughty tyrant man." He wanted to make it clear that he was a man of peace, that this was a message of peace, and that Native people were peaceful as well in their intent and in the historical record. There are many who are said to be honorable warriors who, in the wisdom of their civilized legislation, think it no crime to wreak their vengeance upon whole nations and communities, until the fields are covered with blood and the rivers turned into purple fountains, while groans like distant thunder are heard from the wounded and the tens of thousands of dying. We cannot but see that one mode of warfare is as savage as the other. This is always Apess's rhetorical strategy, to sort of turn the tables. If natives are thought of as savage, but he's saying, but look what you have done, and we'll look at your own records that show what you have done. And when he's talking about these things, these are not abstract to him. These rivers covered in blood and purple fountains, this was in fact the fate of the Pequot, who were literally attempted to be wiped out in genocide in 1830 and 1636. Mm-hmm. Apess wrote, "The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, and without asking liberty from anyone, they possessed themselves of a portion of the country and built themselves houses, and then made a treaty and commanded them to sign it. This, if now done, it would be called an insult, and every white man would be called to go out and act the part of patriot to defend their country's rights." It appears that a treaty was made by the Pilgrims and the Indians, which treaty was kept during 40 years. That was with Massasoit. The young chiefs during this time were showing the Pilgrims how to live in their country and find support for their wives. In other words, it was the natives who were showing the Pilgrims how to live, how to plant, how to support themselves. And again, turning the tables on this idea that native people were living in a dense primeval wilderness, or that it was the English who were always the givers and not the native people who were. It must be recollected that this war, King Philip's War, was legally declared by Philip. He wants to erase the idea that native people just indiscriminately poured out of the woods and sacked towns and killed innocent villagers, so that the colonies had fair warning. It was no savage war of surprise, as some suppose, but one sorely provoked by the Pilgrims themselves. How deep, then, was the thought of Philip, when he could look from Maine to Georgia and from the oceans to the lakes and view with one look all his brethren, withering before, and let me just read a little bit from the eulogy itself. Withering before the more enlightened to come, and how true his prophecy that the white people would not only cut down their groves, but would enslave them. Had the inspiration of Isaiah been there, he could not have been more correct. Our groves and hunting grounds are gone, our dead are dug up, our council fires are put out, and our foundation was laid in the first legislature to enslave our people by taking from them all rights, which is strictly adhered to ever since. Look at the disgraceful laws disenfranchising us as citizens. Look at the treaties made by Congress, all broken. Look at the deep-rooted plans laid when a territory becomes a state, that after so many years the law shall be extended over the Indians that live within their boundaries. Yea, every charter that has been given was given with the view of driving the Indians out of the states or dooming them to become chained under desperate laws that would make them drag out a miserable life as one chained to the galley. He goes on to say that even the President of the United States tells the Indians they cannot live among civilized people, and we want your lands and must have them and will have them. And all that to say that while the eulogy on King Philip is really a brilliant reconsideration of history and countering English claims as though they are the ones that are bringing civilization to the natives, Apess would have it that it's the natives who practiced hospitality and kindness and Christian kindness and brought that to the Europeans. But it's also a very contemporary piece, and he's talking about the laws of the time, and he's talking about the things that are happening in his lifetime, like the Cherokee Removal and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, all of which are huge, important issues that are taking place and have great significance for Apess himself. So I probably have overstayed my talk here. I'll pass through some of this stuff. You can come across it yourselves when you read the eulogy. But King Philip was ultimately hunted down and killed. And as Apess reminds us, his head was placed on a gibbet in front of the Plymouth colony, and there it stayed for 20 years, along with the heads of the other leaders of the resistance. And then Philip's son and wife were taken as slaves and sold in the West Indies. And in fact, that had happened to the Pequots in 1836 as well, where they were sold into slavery. And he says, should conduct so scandalous, so outrageous, making them appear so despicable in the eyes of the Indians, and even now in this audience, I doubt that there is men honorable enough to despise the conduct of those pretended Christians who deal in slavery and enslavement. And so this is also a very pointed speech against the current laws about slavery that are happening in Apess's time. So that is William Apess and a little taste of his eulogy. I do want to point out before finishing that the Pequot are still with us today, amazingly enough, after everything they've survived. This is their museum and research center that you can go visit if you ever make it down to Pequot territory. They have a casino you might want to visit as well. And this is their insignia, and the Mashpee are still around as well and have a powwow every year in July, which is very entertaining and fun to see. And Apess concluded his eulogy saying, "Let peace and righteousness be written upon our hands and hearts is the wish of a poor Indian." So thank you for your time. I apologize, Sarah, if I went over a little bit. And
it was great. Really great. I mean, he's, it's impossible to stop talking about Apess because he's such a figure, and this is such a powerful piece of writing. So some questions are coming up. I just want to say, I want to ask, I just want to start with one question though, which is, you talk in your own writing through about the idea of unwitnessing. This is what has happened in the way that history has been portrayed, that we talk about the terror felt by colonists and we talk about the violence wreaked upon them, but not the other side. But what is Apess's solution? Is it witnessing? Is that what he thinks will solve the problem?
Yeah, that is, I guess, the answer to it's. Bearing witness is a huge part of what Apess is doing. He comes to the Mashpee community, and he's not Mashpee himself. He was actually adopted into the tribe, and the Mashpee still really value their relationship with William Apess. But nevertheless, Apess decides, I will bear witness for the Mashpee, and he doesn't just do it by coming up with the strategy by which they will sort of gain the public support that they eventually gain, but it's by he goes from church to church. It's amazing how much ground he covers, talking about the Mashpee situation, the injustices that were done when, like when people are accused of rioting, when in fact they've been peaceful, and when they're accused of breaking and entering, when in fact that was a building that was built for their purposes. Mm-hmm. And Apess makes this story public, and he has connections in the press that he's cultivated over years. And so he's bearing witness in a very public manner to a side of history that could easily have been buried by the press and all those fake news reports that I showed, right? And so, yeah, it's breaking through that wall, because what I mean by unwitnessing it's not that we don't see it or we erase this history. It's like I said at the start of this talk. We all know it's true. We all know we're here by right of conquest, but that's uncomfortable. And so we agree to sort of not see it. And even today, I do believe that the resistance is great. When you start talking about these things, you have people who are, I'm in Virginia. The new governor just won his campaign, running on how much critical race theory was destroying American schools. Critical race theory is simply acknowledging this history. It's bearing witness, and the act of bearing witness meets a great deal of resistance in this country if you bear witness to things that we don't want to see.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question related to that that's come up from somebody who I know knows a huge amount about King Philip's War. And he says, actually, his understanding was that Philip did launch a surprise attack. So, but that's not the main point. The point is, there was.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Philip did want to.
Philip launched a surprise attack,
yeah,
as opposed to what Apess says. But the main point he's making is there was huge bloodshed on both sides. And this is not acknowledged by Apess. So what do you say to that?
Well, Apess talks about the violence. You mean, whether it was a surprise attack or not? I mean, really,
sorry. The terror people felt, the bloodshed, the cutting off of heads by both sides did this.
Yeah, well, William Apess does talk about the dismemberment of Philip's body. Apess,
but the issue is he doesn't talk about the dismemberment of colonial bodies.
Yeah, so, and you can make that case, I guess, if you feel invested. I mean, the thing that William Apess is confronting is the fact that we've had, in his time, you've already had 200 years of saying how, it's Indians did this and Indians did that, and they are the violent ones and they're the savage ones. He does, perhaps in his defense, if he needs to be defended on this, he says, one type of warfare is just as savage as the other. He doesn't necessarily deny that atrocities are being committed, but he is trying to suggest that we haven't looked at how the violence that has been generated from the European side, and that in fact that violence historically has been a great deal more than anything that Native people ever did. But he, remember that William Apess is a veteran, and he understands. I mean, he's been in combat himself. He's speaking from experience. He's seen it. He knows what it is, and he knows that war is violent. And it's not like one side's going to be violent and the other side are just hapless victims. That this is what war is, and war is hell. And he speaks out against war throughout all of his writings.
Yeah. Okay, another question is whether Apess had access to Roger Williams' writings and what he might have thought about those.
To whose writings?
Roger Williams.
Yeah. So he references Roger Williams, mm-hmm. and he looks at Roger Williams as an ally to Native people at the time. It's hard to know exactly what Apess read or what he didn't read or what precisely his sources were, but he's also, I think, so what's important to recognize is that as he's building up this historical reconstruction of sorts, he's not only drawing from the archival sources of the colonists, although he is drawing from the colonial archive, but he's also drawing from the oral testimonies of people in the Mashpee community. where he's really starting to learn about King Philip and King Philip's War. And, the Mashpee community, they were, this was all really, this is the war where they were dispossessed of their culture and their lands. And nevertheless, the Revolutionary War was still very fresh to them. They had lost something like 75% of their men in the Revolutionary War. They were the largest precinct, or whatever you want to call it, district of enlistment came from the Mashpee community, fighting alongside the colonists against the British. And they suffered greatly in these wars, but they remembered these things, and they had their own history. They still do to this day. It's so fascinating when you run into people from the Mashpee community and any other indigenous community as well. And they're all historians, and they'll talk about King Philip's War as though it happened yesterday. And the people who you see in these histories, they're like, yeah, I was that person's great granddaughter or whatever. And so there was a real oral narrative. And I think in that oral narrative, there was an idea that Roger Williams was an ally and a friend.
Right. Just a couple more. So somebody asks, somebody who works with the Poconokeets asks, the Poconokeets, the tribe of the Massasoit, excuse me for mispronouncing, Usaquem, Mequem, are also alive and well in Rhode Island. Didn't he, that is Apess, refer to them and not the Wampanoags?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
Apess rarely even uses the term Wampanoag. But Pokanoket are also part of the Wampanoag tribe. They were a branch of it, and so I don't know that he ever uses that term. So Apess is it's interesting. I mean, he claims a direct relation. He claims his own direct ancestry to King Philip in his autobiography, A Son of the Forest, and that's unclear if that could be true or not. He says that's what he was told. That could just be a publicity stunt on his part to bring attention to himself. But his sense of tribal affiliation, whether by choice or because he just wasn't that concerned with that, it doesn't always come through. So he's not really too concerned in his writing in the 1800s. And we could fault him for this, I guess. It's just a different dynamic than today, where tribal sovereignty is everything. And we think of that as, from an indigenous perspective, that this is what all of these indigenous groups are claiming for themselves and trying to be recognized on a state or governmental level. But this wasn't the big concern in Apess's time, and it could easily have seen that or felt to him that all these communities were related. There was really just a lot of interconnectedness and kinship networks that transcended what today we recognize as these sort of discrete tribal units.
Yeah. Several people have just mentioned Apess as a Methodist minister. Maybe, but without a specific question, but maybe you could just comment on the role of the role of his religion.
Yeah, it's so hard to understand. It's on the most broadest level, it's hard to understand why would Apess be a Christian when he sort of acknowledges all the harm that Christians have done to Native people. But he's not concerned with that. Christianity is kind of the power that you have to deal with. You really can't stand outside of it as a Native person at this particular time. But he was really, although as a child he claims to have been really attracted to the Methodists, but when he comes back from the war, it's his Aunt Sally George, who is a Pequot woman, and she's a leader of she's really a leader of the Pequot community at the time, spiritual leader, medicine woman probably. She's a healer, and she takes Apess in, and she's the one that really trains Apess up, and she would run these camp meetings on a fairly regular basis, and people would come from all around for Aunt Sally George's camp meetings. And Apess, I think, was deeply influenced by the power of those camp meetings and the way that they helped to build indigenous community. But he didn't have that belonging he'd been a stranger to his own Pequot community in many ways. And I think he saw his avenue through the Methodist community. And the Methodists were outliers at the time. They were considered the noisy Methodists, and they were kind of they were looked down upon, and they were often confronted with people trying to break up their meetings and whatnot. They didn't have established churches. They met in the woods, and they had a very their meetings were such that they really encouraged extemporaneous speech. The Spirit would move you, and you would talk. And I think this was really healing for Apess, because I didn't go into everything that he went through in his life here. I didn't have time, but he dealt with a lot of traumatic things in his life, and I think there was no way to voice that trauma. There was no outlet for it in the settler colonial community, and even the networks of Christianity, except these meetings where all of a sudden you could just let it out and speak it. And Apess seemed to have an ability to articulate himself in these moments and call upon that Spirit and speak in a very persuasive and perhaps contagious way. And so this was an outlet for him. He met a lot of resistance in the Methodist Church. Ultimately, he wanted to be a preacher, and he started preaching. He was reprimanded because he didn't actually have a license, and then he tried to do it through the normal channels. And so you had to go through all these stages as a Methodist to become a Methodist preacher, and you had to join the church. You had to be a teacher in a community for a while, and then you would go out on the circuits, and ultimately you could reach ordination. And he tried to get ordained in 1831. 1829. He was refused. And then the church split apart, and he was finally ordained in 1832 by the sort of branch of the Methodist Church that had broken away from the main church. And they, I guess, were looking for people and willing to include Native people into their congregation. And so that's how he became a Methodist preacher. I would say within a couple of years, I don't think it mattered to him that he was a Methodist. Once he had that ordination, that sort of validation, and he could preach all over the place. And then I think he just he sort of walked away from the church. He wasn't part of their organizational structure, and he just preached where and when and how he wanted.
Okay, and one of our participants has a short story she wants to share, but let's keep it brief, Anne, because we're going to run out of time, but it does sound really important. So I'm going to unmute her for just 1 minute. It's in regard to the Mashpee revolt.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. So back in the 1970s, I was a new young lawyer and joined the legal team for the Mashpee Wampanoags in their land claim in federal court. And their land claim was never heard because the land developers said, that they're not even a tribe. They don't have standing to bring a land claim. So the judge held a trial on whether their identity as a tribe. And during the course of the evidence, of course, all the colonial records, all the early US accounts of their history were allowed into evidence. But when someone took the stand, and Apess's book was revered by many Mashpee families, many still had the leather-bound original publications in their homes, passed down from generation. And when one of them was on the stand and talking about the sacredness of this book in their family generations, and they tried to get it into evidence, there was an objection, and the judge, himself a Mayflower descendant, said, well, we can't allow the history written by one of the participants.
Right.
That's going to be biased. We just can't allow the jury to see that. And so it was just so unjust and ironic that they would, just verify everything that Apess was talking about in his book at the trial in the 1970s. And I ultimately married one of the tribal leaders, Russell Peters, who himself was the great-great-great-grandson of Blind Joe Amos. So anyway, I've just really enjoyed, I've been reading Apess, through the years, but I really enjoyed your work and appreciate very much this talk.
Oh, thank you, and that is incredible, right? I'm trying to remember the name of the scholar who wrote about was it Jack Campisi who wrote the
Yes,
book about
yes,
the trial?
yes.
Yeah, and that's really an amazing story. And so we just had an event in Coleraine, Massachusetts, where William Apess was born, and I've been trying to get Coleraine to recognize William Ape that he was born here. They had no record of him anywhere in the town, and it was like he never existed. And I was like, he's the most famous person to ever come out of your town. You should recognize it. We actually was able to get a plaque built in front of the town library, and so we had an event recognizing Apess just a couple of weeks ago in Coleraine,
Oh,
and we had uh, uh, David Peters was there, and we had
David Whedon?
no. David Peters came. Robert Peters
Oh,
was
Robert Peters.
there,
Okay.
and Deborah Spears Moorhead was there, who is she's and so we had people from the Mashpee tribe there. We had a few other people the year before. Gail Hendricks Hill was
Mhm.
there. Anyways, it was great, and so the Mashpee community, they really um, they still revere Apess in those ways more than the Pequot community. Strangely enough, I don't want to go into those politics, but it's interesting.
There's another question from Roxanne. Here you go, Roxanne.
Yes, I enjoyed reading Apess's eulogy and was struck by what for me felt like the reason for the eulogy, which is he is arguing for equal rights of Native people, and he keeps on saying, demanding rights and saying, we do not have rights, we need rights. Um, there's one point where he's talking about rights of colored people, and I saw this very much as a piece not only for rights of Native people, but also alluding to the growing movement in the United States at that point for rights of other enslaved people, the enslaved Africans. So that's really more of a comment and getting your perspective on that emphasis on rights and legal rights. We have no legal rights. We deserve legal rights, etc.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand this, and because it's not taught, and we don't understand. But Native people in the 19th century in the Northeast and really across the eastern seaboard, they had no rights. In New England, these tribes had been sort of literally conquered for by the time the Apess is writing, it's been 200 years under colonial rule, and they had the system of overseers, and the overseers had basically asserted ultimate control over their lives. I mean, there was nothing they could do really to make money. A lot of them were on whaling ships, the men at least, because that was one of the few jobs that they could make. It was one of the most dangerous jobs you could possibly do, and you'd be away from home for years at a time. And then when they get back, the overseers that could literally claim their money, because the natives were just wards of the state, and it was believed that they couldn't handle their finances and they would just squander it. And so excuses were made for these white overseers to have this absolute control over these communities, and it was crushing, and tragic, and families could be ripped apart. So I don't want to make it the equivalent of slavery. It's not necessarily, but Apess understood that he was speaking to communities of color, and he uses that term quite a bit, actually, people of color, in his writings. And he's very conscious of the practice of slavery. It's really the whole point of the eulogy on King Philip, where it reaches its crescendo, is when he says Philip's son and wife were sold into slavery. And this is the most emotional moment in the eulogy. And he realizes that he's speaking, or he's trying to reach people, a northern audience that may have sympathetic feelings towards abolition. They may not, but he's certainly making a moral case for it. What complicates this is that William Apess's own mother was a slave, or an enslaved person, I should say. Slavery was not just a southern institution when William Apess was born. It was a northern institution as well. Connecticut still had practiced slavery. And I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that when Apess was born, so his mother, Candace, was an enslaved person. I can't remember the name of the person that she worked for right now, but or that she was owned by. And the laws of Connecticut stated that that those who were born in the state, as was true in many states, that if your mother was enslaved, then your condition too would be one as an enslaved person. That was the law, that your state or status followed that of your mother. And so William Apess would have legally been a slave himself had he been born in Connecticut. I don't know if that's why his parents went up to Coleraine in Massachusetts, where those states did not exist, but because he was born in Coleraine, he was not legally enslaved. And so these communities were tightly connected. The indigenous communities and African American communities, they lived together quite often. They intermarried. And William Apess understood all this, and it was very, again, this was not an abstraction to him. Slavery wasn't an abstraction to him. It was very close to him. His mother was a slave. So he spoke to these issues, but he identified himself, he could have technically identified himself as African American, I suppose. I think he consciously did not, because it was probably, if you're looking at the hierarchy of things, it was better to be perceived as a Native person than as an African American in colonial or early America. So that's probably a strategic choice that he had to make. And who would ever want to make that choice? So he lobbied very strongly for African American causes. He was actually the preacher, the in-house preacher at William Lloyd Garrison's church in Boston. Garrison didn't own the church, but it was the church he attended, and it was the church that was the sort of the center for abolitionist movement in New England. And Apess, for a season in 1832, was really their in-house preacher. He was preaching there twice a week for a period of months.
I have a question, which is, as you mentioned Frederick Douglass, and when I read the eulogy, we reread it today, I thought again, this is so much like what to the slave is the 4th of July. So absolutely, but I just made me think, what do people in his audiences, how do they receive these really bold, even provocative statements, or maybe not provocative, but really bold, strong, powerful statements when they're sitting in the Odeon on Federal Street in Boston? Who
good
were the
question.
people in the audience, and how would they have felt?
It was I think theaters at the time, like there was kind of a reputation in that period where you weren't supposed to just listen. It wasn't uncommon for people to talk back or to throw things, or all that sort of stuff. One of his, I think it was his first sermon in Coleraine, or his second, like people found out the Indian was preaching. This was a spectacle. The fact, this is why it's always in the newspapers. You have an Indian preaching. That is a rare thing, and people would come. And I have to imagine that they weren't all. It was not a friendly audience. What you have to admire about William Apess is and I take this to heart. I believe, and I try to learn from William Apess himself, his rhetorical style. How do you stand up before a resistant audience and speak truth to them? And part of the way he does that is he claims that Christian mantle and he builds a sort of moral argument around that. But he also always, he ends like what it says on the screen right now: let peace and righteousness be written upon our hands and hearts. He's not asking people to be, to how to say this. He's not trying to confront them and saying it's your fault and point the finger at you and you're all racist. He's saying, this is what happened. And I get this history that I've pieced before you is being taken from your own words, the words of your forefathers and your people that you're descended from. And so let's look at this message and learn from it and see if we can't come together. And he was able to do that in a sort of brotherly way. And if that's the right word, an amicable way. I don't know what the gift is that allows you to speak truth to power and not be run out of town on a rail. I mean, William Lloyd Garrison was tarred and feathered in his day, or chased out of towns, and so was Frederick Douglass. Not to say that he didn't have those kind of responses, and he was viewed as a troublemaker. He was jailed. He was at one point, when he was preaching to the Pequot, he was beaten within an inch of his life, and I have the court reports to speak to it. It's not that he didn't meet resistance, but when he spoke in these big public forums, people more or less listened to it and received it, and he seems to have been a very effective voice in that arena.
Mhm. I mean, the fact that he gave this oration so many times and it was published, it is really means that there was a big audience. So I guess we can only speculate.
Yeah, it's said that with the OD, so you can see it you can gather some of it from the newspaper reports, but it's always a little opaque. So after his first performance of this at the Odeon, there was a statement in the papers that people were dissatisfied with it, and so he was going to give it again, maybe in a different form. And we don't know how it might have changed or what might have been the trouble. It's hard to say. That could have just been a way for Apess to say, I want to give it again, and maybe he's just ginning up his own publicity by saying there was outrage, right? I wouldn't put that past him. He's kind of a pretty good self-marketer, along with everything else. And one of the things that's amazing about him is the ground that he covered, because even if you were driving today, and he didn't have a car, I don't even know that he had a horse. I think he walked most places, took boats and barges, and got to anywhere. He was on foot for the most part, and he just went night after night. You can follow it in the newspaper stories, and he's in one town, then he's in the next town, then he's in the next town, and he just never stopped. He was such he just spread the word. And as I was saying earlier, he bore witness for indigenous communities, to people that wouldn't have known of them otherwise, because indigenous communities were small little pockets of poverty hidden out of the way. And if nobody was telling that story, nobody was going to know about it. It was like they didn't exist.
Yeah. Fantastic. Really fantastic. So we're a little over time, but does anybody have a last question? No? Somebody's really happy that they gave the eulogy at Portsmouth, New Hampshire when he first gave it, because she's from New Hampshire. So,
well, good. I've been to that. I went to the University of New Hampshire, and when I was doing this research, everybody thought the Odeon was the first one, and it turns out it's there right in the Portsmouth. What is it? The
right
Portsmouth.
there. Yeah.
It was in their newspapers that he came to deliver a eulogy on King Philip, and not only did he deliver it there, the church is still standing. It was the Methodist church at the time. It's now, I believe, it's called the Stone Church. It's right, sort of a block off downtown Portsmouth, and so you can go to the place where the eulogy on King Philip was first delivered in some form or another. And there it is.
We should have a little exodus and go.
I believe that. Yes.
Yeah. So somebody is saying, thank you, excellent presentation. And I want to say a couple practical things, but really this was wonderful. So I'll come back to that. So thank everybody. Thank you all for coming. We want to see you on the 12th of July when we are reading Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative to look at the unwitnessing, really good example of unwitnessing. And we're also going to be reading Lisa Brooks' interpretation of Rowlandson, which you get the two sides.
I should say that Lisa Brooks was there when we celebrated Apess Day over in Coleraine 2 weeks ago. So,
and we did tape this, and we'll be posting it on our website in about a week. We'll send you a survey. I know we repeat the questions, but that's so we can compare your answers. It's really helpful to us. And if you have any questions, send us an email anytime. Send us a donation. We need the money. And thank you again for coming. And a really big thanks to Drew Lopenzina for really fantastic presentation and opening our eyes to someone none of us had ever heard about. Really
thank
important.
you.
Thank you. Oh, people are clapping.
Yeah.
Okay.
The sound of one hand icon clapping.
Yeah, I pity we can't all do it. Okay. Thank you all so much. I'm going to James, I think we can end the Zoom.
Sounds good. I will end it now.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.